Hello everyone, and welcome to our channel where history comes alive through vivid and deeply moving stories. Join me as we journey back to the darkest years of World War II, when Poland stood amid the firestorm of invasion, torn apart and seemingly destined to disappear forever. Yet in that brutal darkness, a nation rose with unbreakable courage, preserving its soul, its culture, and its faith. Poland is not yet lost. Today's story will take you through a harrowing yet inspiring journey of bravery, unity, and the indomitable will of a people who refuse to be erased from the world map. Are you ready to explore Poland's epic of resilience with me? The air in Warsaw carried an uneasy chill in the summer of 1939, though the days were still warm. Cafes along Nowy Świat bustled with students arguing politics and poets scribbling verses, but beneath the chatter throbbed a low, unspoken dread. Across Europe, radio bulletins spoke of ultimatums and mobilizations. In smoky apartments, fathers lingered a little longer before bedtime, aware that the ticking clock of peace was running out. Yet amid the gathering storm, a refrain passed quietly from lip to lip. Jeszcze Polska nie zginęła. Poland is not yet lost. It was more than the opening line of a national anthem. It was a promise whispered like a prayer. Poles had survived centuries of partitions and foreign masters. They had clawed back independence only 20 years earlier, and they carried the stubborn conviction that no invader could extinguish the soul of their republic. Faith unshakable, almost defiant, was the shield they lifted against the rising thunder of war. Priests spoke of sacrifice from pulpits lit by candles. Teachers reminded their pupils of Kosciuszko and the long fight for liberty. Even in the cafes, where cynical laughter often dulled hard truths, conversations returned to the same vow: if Poland was threatened, her people would endure. That vow would soon be tested beyond imagination. At dawn, on September 1st, 1939, the sky itself seemed to split. Sirens wailed as the first Stuka dive bombers screamed downward, their shrieking sirens designed in trade to paralyze with terror. Within hours, columns of the Wehrmacht armored panzers, flanked by fast-moving infantry, rolled across Poland's western frontier. What the world would come to know as Blitzkrieg, the Lightning War, had begun. The attack was breathtaking in its precision and speed. German armor punched through defensive lines before many Polish units could fully mobilize. Railway junctions and airfields were pounded into twisted wreckage. Civilians caught on open roads scattered in panic as columns of refugees collided with advancing tanks. Still, the Polish army fought with desperate courage. Cavalry officers led charges against armored vehicles, sabers flashing in the early morning sun, a symbol of valor if not modern tactics. In the air, outnumbered Polish pilots flung their outmatched fighters at swarms of Messerschmitts, scoring surprising victories, despite impossible odds. The defense was fierce, but the onslaught was relentless. European capitals listened in shock. Britain and France issued declarations of war on Germany, but their promised aid remained mostly words. Inside Poland, people clung to radios for any glimmer of Allied action, but the Western Front stayed eerily quiet. Then came the second, more devastating blow. On September 17th, as Polish forces strained against the German advance, the Red Army crossed the eastern frontier. The secret pact between Hitler and Stalin, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Agreement, revealed its cruel intent. Two great powers had conspired to erase Poland from the map once more. Imagine the despair of soldiers who, after weeks of bitter fighting, now faced a new enemy from the opposite horizon. Commanders who had once sworn to defend every inch of soil were forced into an impossible calculus fight: both giants and be annihilated or retreat to save what fragments of their forces they could. In border towns like Brest and Lwów, villagers awoke to the rumble of Soviet tanks rolling down cobblestone streets. Farmers who had watched German columns burn their western neighbors now saw red stars gleaming in the east. Whose side are we on? Children asked their mothers. The only honest answer was silence. Government ministers, realizing the trap was sprung, fled through Romania to regroup abroad. President Władysław Raczkiewicz and other leaders reached France, vowing that Poland had not surrendered even if her soil lay in enemy hands. A government in exile was born, its members carrying only papers, memories, and an unbroken sense of legitimacy. For the people left behind, life became a daily act of quiet rebellion. As German panzers occupied Warsaw and the Soviets tightened their grip in the east, Polish citizens continued to murmur that stubborn anthem, Jeszcze Polska nie zginęła. Mothers taught the words to infants as lullabies. Priests whispered it during Mass when German patrols prowled outside. School teachers risked arrest to write it on blackboards before erasing it just as quickly. Faith in eventual freedom was not naive, it was oxygen. Every whispered lyric defied the occupiers' claim that Poland was finished. The opening chapter of Poland's nightmare had been written a lightning conquest, a cruel partition, and the first taste of life under two totalitarian regimes. But the story was far from over. Beneath the rubble and the terror, an ember of defiance glowed. The Polish people, scattered and bloodied, were already imagining ways to resist to preserve their language, their culture, and their very identity. This was the beginning of a saga that would stretch through 6 years of unimaginable hardship, secret schools and clandestine presses, starvation and mass deportations, and the ultimate gamble of open rebellion. In the face of overwhelming force, Poland's spirit refused to yield. The invaders could occupy the land. They could topple monuments, burn libraries, and outlaw songs, but they could not silence the heartbeat of a nation that had risen from the ashes before and would again. The first days of September 1939 became a living nightmare that unfolded with ruthless speed. Dawn broke over a landscape already trembling from the roar of engines and the shriek of Stuka dive bombers. For those who had prayed that diplomacy might avert war, the sudden thunder of bombs was an unthinkable awakening. Entire villages watched in frozen disbelief as the sky darkened with German aircraft, their sirens wailing like instruments of doom. The Wehrmacht's strategy was unlike anything Europe had seen. Columns of panzers lunged forward with terrifying precision, slicing through defensive lines as if they were paper. Motorized infantry poured through the gaps, supported by artillery that rained destruction on rail junctions and bridges. Polish troops, though brave and determined, were forced to fight a modern mechanized army with outdated equipment and limited air cover. Yet courage was everywhere. At Mokra, a brigade of Polish cavalry held off German tanks for hours, using the dense forest to ambush armored columns. The legendary charge of the 18th Pomeranian Uchland swords drawn against steel has often been misremembered as a futile dash against tanks. In truth, it was a calculated assault on infantry that inflicted real damage and bought precious time for civilians to flee. These were not relics of a bygone age, but soldiers willing to exploit every weakness in the enemy line. Ordinary citizens displayed equal resolve. Railway workers risked their lives to divert supply trains away from German capture. Farmers dismantled bridges overnight to slow the invaders. School teachers transformed classrooms into first aid posts. Despite the chaos, a kind of grim unity took hold, a shared conviction that every hour gained was another hour for the government to rally international support. But the hoped-for help from abroad never came in the way people imagined. On September 3rd, Britain and France declared war on Germany, fulfilling their treaty obligations to Poland. Across Warsaw, church bells rang in cautious celebration, and for a brief moment, Poles believed salvation was near. Yet on the Western Front, the Allies mounted only a token advance, quickly dubbed the Phony War. To Poles huddled in basements as bombs fell, the silence from the West was deafening. By mid-September, the speed of the German advance was staggering. Cities like Łódź and Krakow fell one after another. Refugee columns, women clutching infants, old men pushing carts stacked with bedding and bread clogged the roads. Military convoys struggled to move past them, sometimes halting entirely as Luftwaffe pilots strafed both soldiers and civilians without distinction. Survivors remembered the acrid stench of burning wagons and the eerie quiet that followed each attack, broken only by the cries of the wounded. Yet the Polish army did not simply collapse. At the Bzura River, General Tadeusz Kutrzeba launched a daring counteroffensive, catching the Germans off guard and inflicting significant losses. For a brief time, the tide seemed to turn. Prisoners were taken, supply lines threatened. But German air superiority and reinforcements soon overwhelmed the defenders. The Bzura battle became both a testament to Polish bravery and a grim reminder that valor alone could not halt the mechanized onslaught. Warsaw itself became a fortress. Civilians dug trenches and erected barricades from paving stones and overturned trams. Children carried water to fire brigades, dodging shrapnel with a maturity forced upon them by war. The city endured relentless bombing. Iconic landmarks like the royal castle were reduced to rubble. Still, the capital refused to yield its people, singing patriotic hymns in candlelit basements as shells crashed overhead. Then, on September 17th, a second, even more devastating blow fell. While the Wehrmacht, pressed from the West, Soviet forces poured across Poland's eastern frontier. This was no opportunistic move, but a carefully planned betrayal, part of the secret Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact signed only weeks earlier. Its hidden protocol carved Poland like a carcass to be shared between two predators. For soldiers and civilians already stretched to the breaking point, the sight of Soviet tanks was almost surreal. In villages near Brest and Grodno, mothers stood in doorways, watching columns of Red Army troops advance, their red stars glinting in the weak autumn sun. Many had fled German terror, believing sanctuary lay eastward. Now they faced a new invader equally determined to erase Polish independence. Military commanders faced an impossible choice. General Edward Rydz-Śmigły, Poland's commander-in-chief, ordered forces to avoid combat with the Soviets and retreat toward neutral Romania and Hungary, hoping to preserve what remained of the army for a government in exile. Units cut off from communication often fought anyway, unwilling to surrender to a second aggressor. In skirmishes at places like Wilno and Lwów, Polish defenders clashed with Soviet troops, buying time for civilians to escape but paying with their lives. Government officials fled southward in a desperate exodus. President Ignacy Mościcki, along with key ministers and military leaders, crossed into Romania, where they would regroup and later establish a government in exile, first in France and then in London. Their escape was more than a flight for personal safety. It was a statement of continuity, a refusal to recognize the death of the Republic. In official communiques, they declared that Poland had not surrendered, even though its territory lay under dual occupation. For ordinary people, the double invasion was a shattering psychological blow. Families who had once clung to the hope of Western rescue now felt utterly abandoned. Refugees who had trudged eastward to escape German bombs found themselves face to face with Soviet patrols. Farmers saw their crops requisitioned first by Germans, then by Soviets. Children asked their parents, "Who will protect us now?" and no one could answer. Yet even in this bleakest hour, the old refrain persisted, "Jeszcze Polska nie zginęła." Priests whispered it during hurried baptisms and candlelit chapels. Women scrawled it on scraps of paper hidden in clothing seams. The words were both comfort and quiet defiance, a reminder that national identity lived in the hearts of the people, not in lines on a map. By early October, organized resistance on open battlefields was effectively over. The final major engagement at Kock ended on October 6, 1939, when the remaining Polish units, outnumbered and outgunned, were compelled to lay down their arms. Only a tiny fraction of the army escaped through Romania and Hungary, eventually joining Allied forces abroad. Those who remained faced an uncertain and terrifying future under occupation. The cost of that 5-week campaign was staggering. Tens of thousands of soldiers killed, countless civilians dead, or homeless cities gutted by fire and shelling. But the greater tragedy was only beginning. The German Reich and the Soviet Union now moved swiftly to implement their secret arrangements, dividing the conquered land with bureaucratic efficiency. Germany annexed large western portions, incorporating them directly into the Reich. The central remainder was organized into the so-called General Government, a puppet administration designed to exploit and terrorize. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union seized the eastern territories, folding them into the Belarusian and Ukrainian SSRs. Centuries-old towns found themselves abruptly under a new flag, their residents treated as subjects to be re-educated, deported, or silenced. In the space of a few weeks, Poland, reborn after 123 years of partition only 2 decades earlier, had once again been carved from the map. But maps tell only part of the story. Beneath the paper borders lay a population whose resolve could not be erased with a stroke of ink. Across the countryside, whispers of resistance began to circulate. Teachers hid banned textbooks under floorboards. Former officers sketched plans for underground networks. Families who had lost homes and livelihoods found new purpose in quiet defiance. The next chapter of Poland's struggle would not be fought in set-piece battles, but in secret meetings, sabotage missions, and the unyielding preservation of culture. The Blitzkrieg had conquered territory, but it had not conquered the Polish spirit. The occupiers would soon discover that subjugation of a people who believe their nation is not yet lost is far harder than capturing cities or crossing borders. When Soviet troops swept across Poland's eastern frontier on September 17, 1939, the invasion felt like the final knife thrust into an already bleeding nation. After 2 harrowing weeks of relentless German attacks, Poles had prayed for a reprieve, perhaps even intervention from the Allies. Instead, they awoke to the grim reality that a second juggernaut was descending upon them. Red Army columns rumbled over dirt roads in endless waves, their armored vehicles splashing through autumn mud as propaganda leaflets fluttered from the sky. Moscow insisted it came as a protector of Belarusian and Ukrainian minorities, but the truth was carved in the secret protocol of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. Poland was to be dissected like a carcass, half for Hitler, half for Stalin. For soldiers still holding defensive lines in the east, the shock was indescribable. One lieutenant in the Crazy region later wrote, "We turned our guns east and west, unable to decide who the enemy was. Both were. Commanders had to make agonizing choices. Should they split their forces, risking annihilation on 2 fronts, or withdraw to save what remained of the army? Many units tried to fight both, their loyalty to Poland stronger than any calculation of survival." Skirmishes erupted from Vilnius to Grodno. At the Battle of Sac, Polish Border Protection Corps units inflicted heavy losses on Soviet troops, proving that Defiant still burned hot. But the imbalance was overwhelming. Facing hundreds of thousands of Red Army soldiers with superior armor and artillery, these scattered defenders could only delay the inevitable. Exodus of a government. As the Soviet advance became unstoppable, Poland's leadership confronted the impossible. President Ignacy Mościcki and key ministers, aware that capture would mean either execution or show trials, fled south through Romania. Along with them went General Władysław Sikorski and other senior officers, determined to form a government in exile that could continue the fight alongside Western allies. The escape was frantic. Columns of official cars raced toward the border, often on the same narrow roads crowded with desperate civilians hauling wagons of blankets, pots, and infants. Witnesses remembered ministers abandoning luggage by the roadside to gain speed, while soldiers formed ragged rear guards to hold off Soviet patrols long enough for the leaders to cross into safety. When Mościcki and his cabinet reached Romanian soil, they immediately broadcast a message of defiance. Poland had not surrendered. From exile, first in France, later in London, the new government maintained embassies coordinated with the Allies and organized Polish forces abroad. They became the voice of a nation that existed in spirit even as its land was swallowed whole. Lives torn between 2 tyrannies. For the millions left behind, the Soviet invasion compounded the nightmare. Villagers who had fled German bombings eastward found themselves trapped between 2 merciless occupiers. Families were divided overnight. Sons who had gone to fight in the west could not return. Mothers and sisters were stranded in the east under a new, equally oppressive regime. The Red Army wasted no time consolidating power. NKVD officers followed close behind the soldiers, compiling lists of class enemies, landowners, priests, teachers, and anyone suspected of patriotic sentiment. Arrests began within days. People disappeared at night, loaded onto trucks that rumbled toward remote prisons. Deportation soon followed. Entire families were awakened at gunpoint and herded into cattle cars bound for Siberia or Kazakhstan. Some were sent to forced labor camps in the Arctic Circle, where winter temperatures plunged to lethal extremes. Survivors later described the bitter irony of leaving home still warm with summer harvest scents only to face the desolation of frozen tundra. Meanwhile, on the German side of the partition, the occupation was already tightening its grip. Towns were renamed with German titles, street signs replaced, and citizens forced to register under new authorities. The speed with which Poland's identity was being erased was dizzying. One day, a child attended a Polish language school, the next she was forbidden to speak her native tongue. A country carved like a map. By early October, the formal partition was complete. Germany absorbed Western Poland, declaring cities such as Poznan and Gdansk integral parts of the Reich. Central Poland was organized into the so-called general government, ruled by Hans Frank, with an iron hand. To the east, the Soviets incorporated their share into the Belarusian and Ukrainian SSRs. Ancient towns with deep Polish traditions. Lwów, Białystok, Wilno were suddenly Soviet cities, their Polish inhabitants treated as foreign interlopers on their own soil. The partition line sliced through communities and even individual households. Farmers woke to find their fields under German authority, while their barns lay in Soviet territory. Couples were separated when one spouse's workplace fell on the opposite side of the new border. Trains that once connected families now carried only soldiers and prisoners. Both occupiers sought to extinguish Polish national identity. The Germans emphasized racial hierarchy, casting Poles as subhumans destined for servitude. The Soviets, meanwhile, portrayed their conquest as liberation from bourgeois nationalism, erasing Polish culture under the banner of proletarian unity. Different ideologies, same goal: the obliteration of a free Poland. Seeds of resistance. And yet, even in these darkest weeks, the spirit of defiance refused to die. In candlelit kitchens and shadowed churches, Poles repeated the national refrain, "Jeszcze Polska nie zginęła," Poland is not yet lost. The words became an oath shared in whispers, a secret handshake of hope. Teachers buried banned textbooks beneath floorboards and held clandestine lessons in barns and cellars. Scouts and students passed messages between villages, forming the first threads of an underground network. Former army officers met in forests to plan for the future, convinced that occupation was temporary and that the world would one day answer Poland's call. The courage of ordinary people often carried a quiet, stubborn poetry. A baker in Wilno continued to stamp the Polish eagle into loaves of bread, knowing discovery meant prison. Children chalked patriotic symbols on alley walls at night, only to see them scrubbed away by dawn, and then rewrote them the next evening. Each act was small, but together they formed a tapestry of resistance, proof that the invaders could seize territory, but not the Polish soul. A nation in limbo. By the end of 1939, Poland as a political entity had effectively vanished. Yet for millions of its citizens, the nation lived on in memory and determination. Letters smuggled to London carried not only news of atrocities, but also pledges of loyalty to a free Poland. Refugees in Paris, Budapest, and London formed cultural associations, published underground newspapers, and raised funds for those left behind. This resilience would prove critical in the years ahead. From these early stirrings would grow the vast Polish underground state, a clandestine network of educators, journalists, soldiers, and couriers who refused to accept defeat. Their efforts would sustain Polish culture through the long occupation and lay the groundwork for future uprisings. But for now, as the brutal winter of 1939 approached, the people of Poland faced an unrelenting reality. Two occupying powers, each bent on erasing their homeland, and an indifferent world slow to act. Fields lay untended, markets stood empty, and families huddled in unheated rooms, wondering when or if the nightmare would end. Still, the whispered anthem endured. It drifted through ruined streets and over frozen rivers, a quiet defiance that neither Hitler's Reich nor Stalin's empire could silence. Jeszcze Polska nie zginęła. Poland is not yet lost. By late October 1939, the last organized Polish units had been overwhelmed, and the map of Europe had been violently redrawn. The ink on the secret Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact was scarcely a month old, yet its sinister clauses were already reality. Germany and the Soviet Union, ideological enemies but temporary partners in conquest, had divided Poland like butchers at a slab. Hitler claimed the West. Vast stretches of Polish territory, including the industrial heartlands of Silesia and the ancient port city of Gdansk, were annexed directly into the Third Reich. The central remnant home to millions of people was designated the General Gouvernement, the general government, an occupied zone administered not as a colony, but as a laboratory for terror. Hans Frank Hitler's personal lawyer became its governor general and boasted that he ruled over a giant slave plantation. Stalin, for his part, swallowed Poland's eastern half. The Red Army wasted no time erasing Polish institutions, replacing the Polish zloty with the Soviet ruble and forcing towns to adopt Russian or Belarusian names. Thousands of former Polish officers, civil servants, and clergy were arrested and transported to the far reaches of the Soviet Union. Many would never see their homeland again. For ordinary families, the partition was bewildering. One morning, a farmer might discover his home was now part of the Reich, while his wheat fields across the river lay inside the Soviet Union. Letters to relatives became dangerous. Border fences, guard towers, and military checkpoints cut through once tight rural communities like a fresh scar. A reign of terror begins. Under German occupation, repression was immediate and systematic. The new rulers intended not merely to control Poland, but to remake it as a German land devoid of its national character. They called it Lebensraum, living space, for an expanding Aryan people. To create this space, they sought to shatter the Polish nation at its roots. The first target was the country's leadership. In an operation known as Intelligenzaktion, special SS squads called Einsatzgruppen carried out mass arrests of teachers, priests, physicians, and community leaders, anyone capable of inspiring organized resistance. Armed with pre-war name lists of over 60,000 undesirables, they scoured towns and villages. Thousands were executed in forests and fields. Thousands more were hauled to prisons where torture and summary execution awaited. One Krakow professor who survived the first sweep recalled being herded into a courtyard with hundreds of colleagues from the Jagiellonian University. "They took us away at gunpoint," he later wrote. "And when the gates closed, I knew our Poland had entered a night without stars." The Soviets acted with equal ruthlessness in the East. The NKVD, Stalin's secret police, targeted landowners, officers, and intellectuals. Deportations to Siberia began before winter set in. Whole families vanished overnight, their neighbors waking to find doors flung open and hearth fires cold. Children were bundled onto freight trains bound for labor camps thousands of miles away where temperatures plunged to -40 degrees. Displacement on a massive scale. As the terror unfolded, forced relocation became a defining feature of life under occupation. German authorities seized Polish homes and farms for ethnic Germans imported from other parts of Europe. Over 2 million Poles were expelled from annexed regions, often given only minutes to collect belongings before soldiers marched them to railway stations. Livestock, furniture, even children's toys were confiscated as property of the Reich. Long columns of refugees stretched across muddy roads, businessmen carrying briefcases stuffed with family papers, grandmothers pushing wheelbarrows filled with bedding, children stumbling beside wagons laden with pots and bread. Eyewitnesses spoke of an endless caravan of misery, a human tide trudging through early snowfalls toward the shrunken heart of the general government or into makeshift camps. Inside the Soviet zone, parallel tragedies unfolded. Farmers were ordered to join collective farms. Refusal meant arrest. Polish officers captured by the Red Army were separated from enlisted men and secretly transported to remote prisons. Many of these officers would later be executed in the forests of Katyn and other hidden sites, their graves undiscovered for years, erasing a nation's culture. With the population uprooted, the Germans intensified their assault on Polish identity. Cultural annihilation became policy. Schools above the elementary level were shut down. Universities were closed or gutted. Libraries looted or burned. Museums were stripped of their treasures. Renaissance paintings, medieval manuscripts, ancient church relics, most shipped to Berlin or hidden in private collections of Nazi officials. Public monuments were toppled. Even street names were replaced with German ones, erasing centuries of heritage in a matter of weeks. Polish newspapers and publishing houses were outlawed. Radios were confiscated, silencing the airwaves of local language and music. Playing Polish patriotic songs was punishable by imprisonment or death. A generation of children grew up in secret classes held in basements and barns where teachers risked their lives to teach history and literature from smuggled texts. A young student in Warsaw later remembered our lessons were whispered. The teacher always kept an ear to the door. Every knock felt like the end. Daily life under the general government. The general government soon became a crucible of fear. Food was rationed to near starvation levels. Bread, meat, and sugar were scarce luxuries, their prices manipulated to keep the population weak and compliant. Families survived on thin soups and foraged vegetables. Black markets emerged in shadowed alleys where the brave bartered for contraband flour or salt, risking arrest at every transaction. Curfews were strict, and the sight of SS patrols on moonlit streets sent shutters snapping closed. Public hangings were staged as warnings, wooden gallows erected in city squares, bodies left to sway in the morning sun. The message was clear. Resistance meant death and mercy was a myth. Yet even as terror gripped the cities, whispers of defiance grew. Underground newspapers circulated hand to hand, printed on stolen presses and hidden basements. Couriers carried secret messages between scattered cells of the emerging Polish resistance. People memorized poems and songs, passing them orally so that no written proof could betray them. Seeds of underground resistance. From these desperate conditions, the first organized resistance networks began to coalesce. Former army officers, scouts, teachers, and ordinary shopkeepers formed clandestine groups dedicated to preserving culture and preparing for eventual liberation. Meetings were held in candlelit attics or forest clearings. Passwords and coded phrases became the lifeblood of communication. One of the earliest groups, the Service for Poland's Victory Służba Zwycięstwu Polski, was founded in Warsaw within weeks of the surrender. It would later evolve into the Home Army Armia Krajowa, the largest underground resistance movement in occupied Europe. Its members swore loyalty to the exiled government in London, determined to keep alive the notion of a sovereign Polish state. Women played critical roles, couriers smuggling messages in loaves of bread, nurses tending to wounded partisans, mothers hiding fugitive Jews in cellars beneath their kitchens. Children acted as lookouts, their small size allowing them to slip through checkpoints unnoticed. The occupiers underestimated them all. Defiance in small gestures. Amid systemic brutality, everyday acts of quiet resistance became expressions of national pride. Priests held secret masses in defiance of bans. Bakers scored the Polish eagle onto loaves of bread before sliding them into ovens. Musicians played forbidden folk songs behind closed curtains, their melodies floating through the night like fragile lanterns of hope. Each gesture, no matter how small, affirmed that Polish identity endured. The occupiers could dictate laws and borders, but they could not colonize the human spirit. By the close of 1939, Poland's physical form had been shredded, but its essence remained stubbornly alive. In the alleys of Warsaw, in the frozen forests of the East, in the whispered prayers of deportees bound for Siberia, the nation persisted as something more than land or government. The German and Soviet empires believed they had erased a country. What they had truly done was forge a people whose will to survive would prove more enduring than any tyrant's decree. Even as the borders of Poland were redrawn and the occupiers tightened their grip, the German plan moved beyond mere conquest. Hitler and his advisors understood that to dominate a nation of more than 30 million people, they would have to do more than seize its land, they would have to decapitate its mind. From the first weeks of occupation, the Nazis unleashed Intelligenzaktion, a calculated campaign to annihilate Poland's intellectual and cultural leadership. The goal was chillingly clear: without thinkers, teachers, clergy, or artists to guide them, the Polish people would become a leaderless mass, easier to control, easier to enslave. Armed with pre-war name lists of professors, writers, priests, doctors, and veterans, the SS death squads known as Einsatzgruppen fanned out across the countryside. At dawn, they would bang on doors, drag community leaders from their homes, and march them into the mist. Many never returned. One survivor from Bydgoszcz recalled that the streets would fall silent after midnight, broken only by the distant rumble of trucks. "We knew what that sound meant," he said years later. Someone's name had been on a list. Within weeks, entire town councils, school faculties, and parish staffs simply disappeared. Executions in the forests. The killings were swift and merciless. Forest clearings became makeshift cemeteries. In Piasnica and Palmieri, mass graves swallowed thousands. In the first few months alone, over 16,000 intellectuals were murdered. By mid-1940, the toll exceeded 100,000. Eyewitnesses spoke of professors still wearing their academic gowns as they were lined up and shot. Priests who had blessed newborns and married couples were dragged from confessionals and executed. Libraries were emptied of their guardians, newspapers of their editors. The aim was not only physical eradication, but also the erasure of memory so that future generations might never even know these leaders had existed. To heighten terror, the occupiers made the murders visible. Bodies were sometimes left in public squares for days, a grim warning that education and faith were now crimes. Posters announced mass arrests, neighbors read the names of friends or relatives on the lists and knew that no appeal could save them. Eviction and the quest for living space. The assault on Poland's intellectual class was only the beginning. The Nazis intended to reshape the country's very demographics. Over 2 million Poles, primarily landowners, merchants, and the educated middle class were forcibly evicted from their homes. Entire neighborhoods were emptied in a single night. Families were given minutes to pack, often no more than what they could carry. Soldiers herded them onto trains bound for overcrowded ghettos or the central general government. Their former houses, still warm from morning fires, were handed to German settlers recruited to populate Hitler's envisioned Lebensraum living space for the Aryan race. A mother from Poznan remembered clutching a single quilt as soldiers shouted for her to move faster. "I could hear my youngest crying," she said, "but I could not pick him up. My arms were full. They pushed us out and locked the door behind us. Our own house became foreign in an instant." These expulsions created a rolling humanitarian catastrophe. Refugees clogged roads and railways, their possessions piled high on wagons. Makeshift camps sprang up along rivers and in abandoned barns. Winter winds sliced through threadbare coats as families searched for shelter. Yet even in misery, small acts of solidarity emerged. Villagers shared bread with strangers. Priests opened parish halls to the displaced neighbors, whispered prayers in the dark. Erasing. Culture. Silencing voices. Once the intellectual elite was shattered and homes seized, the occupiers turned to the systematic destruction of Polish culture itself. Schools, theaters, and museums were shuttered. Newspapers were banned, except for those printing German propaganda. Radio receivers were confiscated. Anyone caught hiding one risked execution. Polish books were burned in public squares while orchestras were forbidden to play Chopin, whose music had long symbolized the nation's spirit. The Germans stole or smashed monuments and art-stripping cities of their heritage. A Warsaw librarian later recalled watching soldiers cart off centuries-old manuscripts. "It was like seeing our ancestors kidnapped," she said. "Each book was a piece of our soul." These measures were designed to grind down the sense of national identity until Poles thought of themselves only as subjects, not citizens. Yet the very extremity of the policy provoked defiance. Underground educators organized tajne komplety secret classes held in basements or behind shuttered windows. Children recited poetry from memory teachers, passed worn pages hand to hand, and parents risked arrest to keep their language alive. Life in the ghettos. After dismantling the intellectual and cultural backbone, the Nazis focused their most brutal efforts on Poland's Jewish population, though the suffering extended to all Poles. In April 1940, Jewish residents of Warsaw were ordered to begin constructing a massive walled ghetto in the heart of the ruined city. Warsaw's Jews made up more than 30% of the city's population, yet the ghetto encompassed only 5% of its area. Conditions were predictably catastrophic. Overcrowding was extreme, entire families crammed into single rooms sharing water taps with dozens of neighbors. Sanitation collapsed and diseases like typhus spread with deadly speed. More than 300 ghettos soon dotted occupied Poland, each a place of despair. Food was rationed at starvation levels, forcing residents to smuggle bread and potatoes through hidden holes in the walls or bribe guards for scraps. Children risked their lives to crawl through sewers in search of black market goods. Outside the ghettos, ethnic Poles also endured crushing hardship. German authorities imposed strict rationing, leading to widespread hunger. City dwellers sometimes wandered for days in search of food, only to return with meager handfuls of grain. The mere act of buying bread became an exhausting, perilous quest. Forced labor, the Budienst. Starvation was only one weapon. Another was forced labor. The general government soon required nearly all adults to serve the occupiers' economic machine. At first, the minimum age was 18, but it was soon lowered to 14 for Poles, and even 12 for Jews. This system, known as the Baudienst, sent men, women, and children to work in factories, on farms, or in construction gangs. Many were shipped to Germany itself, never to return. Those who resisted faced brutal punishment. By 1943, failure to report for labor could mean execution, not just for the individual, but for entire families. Villages that failed to meet labor quotas suffered savage reprisals. German troops surrounded settlements at dawn, set houses ablaze, and executed residents as warnings to others. Survivors remembered the acrid smell of burning thatch and the silence of fields where children once played. Survival amid terror. Despite these horrors, ordinary people clung to survival with astonishing resilience. Women organized clandestine soup kitchens, stretching thin rations into communal meals. Priests baptized infants in secret chapels. Musicians played forbidden folk songs behind shuttered windows, their melodies threading through night air like whispers of freedom. Some Poles risked everything to hide Jewish neighbors, constructing false walls in attics or digging earthen bunkers beneath barns. Such acts were punishable by death not only for the rescuer, but for their entire household, yet thousands chose defiance over safety. Every gesture, from sharing a crust of bread to teaching a child the banned Polish anthem, became an act of quiet rebellion. Through these small but fearless deeds, the nation's spirit endured, preparing the ground for the larger resistance that was already beginning to form in shadowed basements and forest clearings. By the end of 1940, the German plan to break Poland's will had not succeeded. The intellectual class had been decimated, but new leaders arose from the ranks of teachers, students, and ordinary citizens. The occupiers had tried to erase a culture, but every clandestine lesson and whispered hymn proved that the Polish soul was not so easily extinguished. By early 1941, the German occupation had entered a colder, more calculated phase. The first wave of shock and chaos was over. Now came the relentless machinery of demographic engineering. Hitler's regime envisioned the annexed Polish territories as a vital extension of the Reich, a living space where German settlers would flourish, while the native population served as expendable labor. To achieve this, millions of Poles were uprooted from ancestral homes in one of the most sweeping campaigns of forced displacement in modern history. German administrators drew up detailed plans for the removal of entire communities. Overnight soldiers would appear in quiet villages or bustling city streets, reading lists of names compiled weeks in advance. Families were ordered to pack a few belongings, often no more than what they could carry in a single suitcase, while armed guards stood watch. Farm animals were seized, household goods cataloged for redistribution, and homes marked for immediate resettlement by incoming Germans from the Baltic states, Romania, or as far away as South Tyrol. Eyewitness accounts reveal the cruel efficiency of these expulsions. In Poznan, residents were awakened before dawn by pounding on doors and the bark of commands in German. Within hours, entire neighborhoods were emptied. Their occupants herded onto trains bound for the general government or temporary holding camps. Children clutched dolls or scraps of bread as parents struggled to keep families together in the confusion. Those who protested risked beatings or execution on the spot. Estimates vary, but historians generally agree that over 2 million Poles were expelled from their homes during the occupation. Many were shipped to makeshift ghettos or rural areas ill-equipped to handle the influx, leading to starvation and disease. Others were deported deeper into the Reich as slave laborers. The purpose was twofold: to make room for ethnic Germans and to shatter the social fabric that might nurture organized resistance. Life in the shadow of replacement. For those who remained in the annexed territories, everyday life became an exercise in humiliation. German became the language of schools, courts, and official business. Polish street names were replaced with German ones. Even family surnames were corrected to sound less Slavic. Signs warned nur für Deutsche only for Germans outside shops, parks, and trams. The occupiers used propaganda to encourage assimilation while threatening brutal punishment for defiance. Children with Aryan features were sometimes seized from Polish families and sent to Germany for forced Germanization, given new names and identities. Parents who resisted were often deported or killed. Economic exploitation was equally ruthless. Farms were confiscated and redistributed to German settlers who arrived with government support, often taking possession of houses still warm from the fires of their former occupants. Polish laborers were conscripted to work these same fields, effectively becoming servants on the land their families had tilled for generations. A farmer from the Łódź region later described the bitterness of harvesting crops for a new master. I plowed the soil of my father while a stranger counted the bushels. My own wheat was weighed against me. Starvation as policy. Food scarcity became a weapon of control. The general government instituted rationing that left Poles with barely enough calories to survive, often less than half of what was allotted to Germans. Bread, meat, and sugar were luxuries. Many survived on thin soups of potato peels and weeds. Malnutrition weakened immune systems, making outbreaks of typhus and dysentery common, especially in crowded cities. Black markets flourished in the shadows. Smugglers risked their lives to bring grain and meat from the countryside into urban centers. Children, nimble and often overlooked by guards, became key couriers, slipping through fences or sewer tunnels with hidden sacks of flour. Getting caught could mean summary execution, but without these clandestine networks, many families would have starved. Even with such efforts, hunger gnawed at daily existence. Diaries from the time describe parents skipping meals so children could eat, or neighbors pooling ration cards to keep the elderly alive through winter. In Warsaw and Krakow, people boiled grass or leather scraps to make broth, while city gardens sprouted in every available patch of earth, empty lots, rooftops, even cemetery plots. The machinery of forced labor. As the war dragged on, the German demand for workers grew insatiable. The occupiers expanded the Baudienst forced labor service, turning it into a massive system of exploitation. Initially, all Poles over 18 were eligible. Soon, the minimum age dropped to 14 and for Jews to 12. Recruitment was brutal. German patrols raided homes and marketplaces, seizing anyone who looked fit enough to work. Caught without proper papers, a person might be thrown onto a truck and shipped to a factory or farm within hours. Families often learned of a loved one's fate only from hastily delivered postcards, if at all. Laborers were dispatched to munitions plants, coal mines, and agricultural estates across the Reich. Conditions were harsh: long hours, inadequate food, and constant surveillance. Many were never paid, and illness or injury often meant abandonment rather than treatment. Those who tried to escape faced severe reprisals not only for themselves but for their entire villages. By 1943, failing to appear for forced labor was a capital offense. Whole communities were punished if quotas were not met. German soldiers would surround a village at dawn, torch homes, and execute residents as a warning. Survivors remembered the acrid smoke of burned thatch and the silence of fields where laughter once echoed. Cultural resistance and quiet defiance. Despite relentless persecution, the Polish spirit of defiance only deepened. In secret, teachers held tajne komplety clandestine classes that preserved Polish language, history, and literature. Students met in basements, barns, or forest clearings, memorizing poetry and copying lessons by candlelight. Discovery meant death, yet parents continued to send their children believing that education was itself an act of rebellion. Underground presses printed forbidden newspapers and pamphlets reporting Allied advances or exposing Nazi atrocities. Couriers, many of them teenage girls, risked arrest to distribute these papers, slipping them under doors or leaving them in church pews. Religious life became another form of resistance. Priests celebrated Mass in secret, often at night and in remote locations. Hymns once sung openly in cathedrals, now whispered through candlelit rooms. Each service was a quiet affirmation that faith and national identity could not be extinguished by decrees. Seeds of organized revolt. These acts of cultural survival laid the groundwork for more overt resistance. Former army officers and ordinary citizens began forming networks that would evolve into the Polish underground state and its military arm, the Home Army, Armia Krajowa. Small sabotage operations cutting telephone wires, derailing trains, tested the occupiers' patience and inspired others to join. Women played indispensable roles as couriers, medics, and intelligence gatherers. Children acted as lookouts or messengers, their small size enabling them to slip past checkpoints. Such participation bound entire families to the cause, weaving resistance into the fabric of everyday life. The Germans underestimated the power of these seemingly minor acts. Every hidden lesson, every smuggled newspaper, every whispered hymn undermined the occupiers' ultimate goal, the total erasure of Polish identity. The unbroken spirit. By the end of 1941, Poland remained a nation in chains, but not in spirit. The occupiers had expelled millions stolen property and attempted to Germanize vast swaths of territory. They had used starvation and forced labor as weapons, hoping to grind down the will of the people. Yet the opposite occurred. Families continued to teach their children the Polish anthem Jeszcze Polska nie zginęła often as a bedtime lullaby. Secret classrooms flourished. Underground newspapers circulated by the tens of thousands. The very hardships meant to crush the nation instead steeled its resolve. A Warsaw school teacher later wrote, "We were hungry, afraid, and often in mourning. But each clandestine lesson was a victory, each word in our language, a reminder that Poland still breathed." The Germans could seize land and demolish monuments. They could force families into exile and conscript teenagers into labor. But they could not conquer a people who carried their nation within their hearts, who believed with unshakable certainty that Poland, though occupied, was not lost. By 1941, the campaign to erase Poland's national identity reached a ruthless crescendo. The German occupiers understood that a people bound by shared culture and memory could never be fully subdued. To break that bond, they waged an all-out assault on Polish language, art, and history, an attack designed not merely to silence, but to make an entire civilization forget itself. Schools beyond the most basic level were the first to vanish. Secondary and university education was banned, ensuring that Polish youth would grow up with little more than elementary arithmetic and enough reading skill to follow German instructions. Laboratories and libraries were emptied, and professors who had escaped the initial purges were forced into hiding. In Krakow, the venerable Jagiellonian University became a ghostly shell, its lecture halls silent under layers of dust. Museums fared no better. Priceless artifacts of Poland's medieval kingdom, illuminated manuscripts, royal regalia, Chopin's handwritten scores were looted and carted off to the Reich. In Warsaw alone, more than 90% of public art collections disappeared. Stolen paintings adorned the private homes of Nazi officials or vanished into secret vaults, while monuments to Polish heroes were toppled and melted down for scrap. Even everyday cultural expressions were targeted. Radios were confiscated or destroyed, their owners arrested for listening to enemy broadcasts. Books were seized and burned in public squares, their ashes swept away as if to erase memory itself. German authorities banned the performance of Polish music, including the works of Chopin, whose compositions had long embodied the nation's indomitable spirit. Yet this cultural extermination ignited a fierce, if quiet, resistance. Teachers organized tajne komplety clandestine classes held in basements, attics, and barns. Lessons in Polish history, literature, and advanced science continued in whispers and coded notes. Parents risked imprisonment or death to send their children to these underground schools, believing that knowledge itself was an act of patriotism. A Warsaw student later recalled, "We studied by candlelight our books hidden beneath sacks of flour. Every equation solved, every poem recited felt like striking a blow against the occupiers." Underground art and literature. Writers and artists joined this shadow war. Secret presses produced newspapers, novels, and plays, many printed on scavenged scraps of paper or mimeographed late at night. Couriers, often teenage girls, slipped these works under doors or left them in church pews for discreet pickup. Shortwave radios hidden beneath floorboards brought news of Allied advances that stoked hope and fed the resistance. Poetry, in particular, became a weapon. Verses memorializing fallen heroes or mocking Nazi officials circulated hand to hand, impossible to suppress. The very act of creating and sharing these works defied the occupiers' decree that Polish identity must vanish. Music, too, refused to die. Though public performances were banned, clandestine concerts filled darkened apartments. Violinists played Chopin nocturnes, while neighbors crowded into cramped rooms, straining to catch every note. Each phrase was a prayer. One survivor remembered, a reminder that our hearts still beat in Polish time. The ghetto's expanding nightmare. While the occupiers sought to erase Polish culture at large, they inflicted their most brutal measures on the Jewish population. Following earlier orders, the construction of walled ghettos accelerated across the general government. The Warsaw Ghetto, begun in April 1940, became the largest and most infamous. Within its brick walls, more than 400,000 Jews, over 30% of the city's population, were crammed into an area barely 5% of Warsaw's size. Streets overflowed with people. Apartments designed for one family housed 4 or 5. Food rations were deliberately set at starvation levels. Jews received as little as 184 calories per day compared to over 2,000 for German residents. Typhus and dysentery spread rapidly through the fetid alleys. Children scavenged through garbage heaps seeking potato peels or crumbs of bread. Smuggling became a lifeline. Young couriers squeezed through cracks in the wall or crawled through sewers to bring in black market food, knowing that capture meant execution. The same tragedy unfolded in Łódź, Kraków, and more than 300 other ghettos across occupied Poland. Each became a waiting room for death, a temporary holding pen before deportation to concentration and extermination camps. Starvation beyond the walls. Outside the ghettos, ethnic Poles endured a different but relentless hunger. German authorities rationed food to keep the population weak and dependent. Bread lines stretched for blocks, and families often survived on watery soups made from cabbage leaves or foraged weeds. City dwellers walked miles into the countryside to barter for a few potatoes, hiding their meager gains under coats to avoid German patrols. Black markets blossomed despite harsh penalties. Housewives and children acted as smugglers, slipping through sewers or across rooftops to trade for flour or eggs. A single loaf of bread could cost a week's wages or a life if discovered. One Krakow mother later wrote in her diary, "Each meal was a triumph, each mouthful a victory. We lived from day to day, never sure if tomorrow would bring food or the knock at the door." Forced labor and the Baudienst. As resources dwindled, the Nazis tightened another vice: forced labor. The Baudienst, or compulsory work service, expanded with brutal speed. At first, all Poles over 18 were subject to conscription. Soon, the minimum age fell to 14 for Poles and 12 for Jews. Recruitment squads raided homes, marketplaces, and even churches, seizing anyone fit enough to work. Families received no warning. A son might step out to buy bread and vanish onto a train bound for a factory deep inside the Reich. Laborers toiled in quarries, munitions plants, and farms under punishing conditions: long hours, little food, constant surveillance. By 1943, failing to report for labor duty carried a death sentence. Entire villages were burned when quotas were not met. Survivors recounted dawn raids in which soldiers encircled a community, torching homes and executing residents as a warning. Quiet defiance. Yet amid starvation and forced labor, defiance flickered everywhere. Underground educators continued their secret lessons. Priests celebrated Mass in hidden chapels. Families taught children the Polish anthem Jeszcze Polska nie zginęła as a bedtime lullaby. These small acts carried immense meaning. Each clandestine class preserved a piece of national memory, Each whispered hymn affirmed that the Polish soul still lived. A teacher in Warsaw later said, "Every lesson we taught was a victory. Every word in our own language reminded us that Poland still breathed, preparing for resistance." By late 1941, these quiet networks began to merge into something larger, the Polish underground state and its armed wing, the Home Army, Armia Krajowa. Former officers, scouts, and civilians formed cells dedicated to sabotage, intelligence gathering, and eventual open rebellion. Women served as couriers, medics, and codebreakers, children as lookouts and messengers. Underground presses printed newspapers detailing Allied victories and exposing Nazi crimes. Sabotage operations disrupted rail lines and destroyed German supply depots, proving that Poland's will to fight remained unbroken. The occupiers who had sought to erase a nation through hunger and fear now faced an enemy that was everywhere and nowhere. Teachers, priests, farmers, and teenagers united by a single conviction that Poland was not dead, only waiting. Despite years of terror, the attempt to annihilate Polish culture had failed. Monuments could be toppled and books burned, but the spirit that bound a people to their history could not be incinerated. In whispered prayers in hidden classrooms and the soft notes of a forbidden nocturne, Poland endured defiant, unforgotten, and unbroken. By 1942, the occupiers' assault on Poland had entered a still darker phase, the mass segregation of Jews and other targeted groups into walled-off ghettos. These ghettos were not merely districts of control, they were way stations to annihilation designed to isolate entire communities before their eventual destruction. The largest of these was the Warsaw Ghetto, established in April 1940, but rapidly swollen to monstrous proportions. Crammed into barely 5% of the city's area, more than 400,000 Jews, over 30% of Warsaw's population, were forced to live behind newly built walls topped with glass shards and barbed wire. The gates closed at dusk, guarded by armed patrols. Within this grim enclosure, life became a daily struggle against hunger, disease, and despair. Food rations were deliberately set at starvation levels, while German citizens in occupied Poland received over 2,000 calories per day. Jewish residents of the ghetto were allotted fewer than 200 less than what a child needs simply to survive. Families boiled grass or potato peels for thin soups, while children crept through sewer tunnels at night to smuggle in bread or onions from sympathetic Polish neighbors. Capture meant instant death, but many continued, for a smuggled crust of bread might keep a family alive for another day. Sanitation collapsed almost immediately. Overcrowding was extreme. 10 or 12 people crammed into a single room, latrines overflowing, clean water scarce. Epidemics of typhus and dysentery swept through the ghetto each winter. Doctors and nurses fought valiantly to provide care, with dwindling supplies, often risking their own lives to treat the sick. "We buried our dead by the hundreds," one physician later testified, yet the spirit of life refused to leave. Other ghettos, same nightmare. The tragedy of Warsaw repeated across occupied Poland. In Łódź, Kraków, Białystok, and more than 300 other ghettos, Jews, Roma, and others deemed undesirable were corralled into small, unsanitary zones. The Łódź ghetto, sealed in 1940, became a bleak industrial prison where residents labored in workshops for the German war machine in exchange for scraps of food. In rural areas, entire shtetls, once vibrant Jewish market towns, were emptied overnight. Families who had lived for generations in close-knit communities were marched to barbed wire enclosures, often within sight of their former homes. For many, the ghetto walls became the last view of familiar streets and fields. Despite unimaginable hardship, life inside these enclosures did not stop. Secret schools taught children to read and write. Rabbis held clandestine services, whispering prayers over candles shielded from watchful eyes. Musicians played soft concerts on smuggled violins, their melodies a fragile defiance against despair. Artists sketched daily scenes on scraps of paper, market stalls, funerals, moments of laughter leaving behind a visual record of resilience amid ruin. Hunger and black markets. Starvation was an ever-present weapon. Official rations were hopelessly inadequate, forcing residents to rely on smuggling and black market trade. Children often became the bravest smugglers, slipping through cracks in walls or crawling under fences to bring back potatoes or flour. They darted through dark alleys with the agility of cats, risking beatings or execution if caught. The ghetto economy became a complex network of barter and secrecy. A pair of shoes might be exchanged for a loaf of bread. A few coins might buy enough coal for a single night's warmth. Jewish police, caught between survival and complicity, patrolled the streets while clandestine soup kitchens fed the weakest. One survivor remembered, "We learned to stretch every crumb. A single carrot was a feast, a handful of beans a celebration." Beyond the ghetto walls, life outside the ghettos was scarcely less brutal for ethnic Poles. The German occupiers maintained strict rationing, leaving most civilians perpetually hungry. City residents trudged miles to barter with farmers, hiding bread or eggs beneath their clothes to evade checkpoints. Black markets flourished despite the threat of execution. Housewives and children became skilled negotiators, trading whatever small valuables remained for a few ounces of flour. At the same time, the occupiers pressed thousands into forced labor. Young men and women and even children were seized in street raids and sent to work on German farms or in munitions factories. Families often received no word of their loved ones' fates. By 1943, evading labor service was punishable by death not only for the individual, but sometimes for entire villages. Glimmers of resistance. Amid such suffering, resistance still found ways to grow. Underground organizations smuggled news of Allied advances into the ghettos and organized secret cultural events to keep hope alive. Teachers risked their lives to hold clandestine classes for children, reminding them that learning itself was a weapon against annihilation. Some Poles outside the ghetto walls risked everything to help their Jewish neighbors. Farmers hid families in barns and dugouts. City dwellers built false walls in attics and cellars. The penalty for harboring Jews was death, yet thousands of Poles, many now honored as righteous among the nations, chose compassion over fear. In Warsaw, members of the Polish underground state coordinated with Jewish resistance groups, sharing intelligence and smuggling in weapons when possible. These fragile networks of solidarity planted the seeds for future uprisings that would shock the occupiers and inspire the world. Deportations to death. By 1942, the ghetto's true purpose became tragically clear. German authorities initiated Operation Reinhard, the systematic deportation of Jews from ghettos to extermination camps such as Treblinka Sobibor and Belzec. Trains arrived without warning. SS officers and local collaborators ordered residents to assembly points with promises of resettlement to the east. People were allowed to bring only what they could carry: bundles of clothes, a few photographs, perhaps a favorite book. Mothers clutched children as soldiers herded them into overcrowded cattle cars with little water or ventilation. Those left behind often knew the truth. They watched in helpless anguish as neighbors vanished, the echo of train whistles fading into the night. Within weeks, ghettos that once held tens of thousands stood eerily silent. In Warsaw alone, more than 300,000 Jews were deported to Treblinka during the summer of 1942, most murdered upon arrival. Courage, amid certain death. Even as the deportations accelerated, pockets of defiance emerged. Jewish fighters began to arm themselves with smuggled pistols, homemade grenades, and a determination that astonished even seasoned partisans. They trained in secret and built bunkers beneath the streets, preparing for a confrontation they knew they could not win but could not avoid. One clandestine diary captured the mood. "We are not waiting for death. We will choose how we die standing." Outside the ghettos, the Polish Home Army expanded its own operations, gathering intelligence for the Allies and planning sabotage missions. Couriers carried reports of mass killings to London, where the Polish government in exile pleaded with the world to act. Too often, their warnings were met with disbelief or bureaucratic delay. Unbroken spirit. Despite starvation, disease, and the constant threat of deportation, life within the ghettos retained sparks of humanity. Weddings were celebrated in cramped apartments. Babies were born and named with whispered blessings. Poets wrote verses of love and defiance on scraps of newspaper, hiding them in walls to outlast the war. As one survivor reflected years later, they could cage us, starve us, even kill us, but they could not stop us from being human. These acts of resilience, quiet, steadfast, profoundly courageous, stood as living proof that the Nazi plan to erase a people's identity would ultimately fail. The ghettos, intended to crush the spirit instead, became enduring symbols of human dignity and the unyielding will to live. As 1942 turned to 1943, the machinery of oppression tightened even further. Hunger, already a constant companion, became a deliberate weapon wielded by the German occupiers to weaken and control both Jews and ethnic Poles. Food rations were calculated not to sustain life, but to push people to the edge of collapse, making them easier to exploit as laborers or to herd onto trains bound for camps. For Jewish residents of the ghettos, official daily rations often fell below 200 calories, a fraction of basic human need. A single loaf of bread could cost a week's wages on the black market. Parents skipped meals so their children might survive another day. Emaciated figures scavenged refuse heaps for potato skins or weeds to boil into thin soup. Starvation became so widespread that historians later described the ghettos as slow-motion extermination. Polish civilians outside the ghettos faced only slightly better conditions. German occupation authorities imposed strict quotas on farmers, confiscating grain and livestock for the Reich, while leaving village families with barely enough to survive the winter. City dwellers relied on clandestine trade, bartering precious heirlooms for sacks of flour or a few eggs. Children risked their lives as smugglers crawling through sewers or hiding food beneath clothing to avoid detection by German patrols. Hunger bred desperation but also resilience. Underground soup kitchens sprang up in cellars and church basements. Neighbors pooled rations and shared scarce vegetables grown in backyard gardens or even cemetery plots. Every small act of sharing was a quiet defiance, proof that the occupiers' strategy of dehumanization could not extinguish compassion. The expanding web of forced labor. While starvation weakened the population, the Germans intensified the Baudienst, the compulsory labor service that became a cornerstone of their economic exploitation. Initially requiring all Poles over 18 to serve, the policy soon extended to adolescents, 14 for Poles, 12 for Jews. Recruitment squads roamed streets and marketplaces, grabbing anyone who looked able-bodied. Raids often began before dawn. Trucks filled with shouting soldiers barreled into villages surrounding homes so no one could escape. Those seized were allowed only moments to grab a coat or a scrap of bread before being shoved onto transports bound for factories, mines, or farms deep within the Reich. Many were sent to armament plants or construction projects vital to the German war machine. Others were dispatched to clear forests, build roads, or harvest crops, often in brutal conditions with inadequate food and no medical care. Survivors were called 12 to 14-hour workdays, beatings for minor mistakes, and constant surveillance. Exhaustion was met not with rest, but with harsher demands. Those who resisted faced collective punishment. If a village failed to supply its quota of workers, German troops returned with fire and gunfire. Entire communities were torched, residents executed or driven into the forests. In some regions, the word Łapanka Roundup became a symbol of terror as people avoided public spaces for fear of sudden capture. Stories from the camps and factories. Accounts from forced laborers paint a grim picture of survival. Janina, a teenager from Lublin, was seized during a raid while walking to church. She spent 3 years in a munitions factory near Hamburg, enduring 12-hour shifts and constant hunger. "We slept on wooden planks," she later said, and dreamed of bread so vividly we could taste it when we woke. Others were sent to massive farms in Germany, where they lived in drafty barracks and worked from dawn until nightfall. Letters home, when permitted, were censored and infrequent. Families often learned of a loved one's death months later, if at all. Despite these hardships, acts of defiance persisted. Workers sabotaged equipment, slowed production, or smuggled intelligence to the Polish underground. Some forged documents to escape and rejoin resistance cells back home. Each act, however small, carried enormous risk, but offered a measure of dignity in a life designed to strip it away. Starvation as collective punishment. As the occupation dragged on, the Germans used starvation not only as economic policy, but as retribution. In rural districts, if partisans attacked a German patrol, soldiers might seal off entire villages, confiscating food supplies and executing livestock to leave survivors destitute. Families watched helplessly as barns were set ablaze, and granaries looted the smell of burning hay mingling with the acrid smoke of their dwindling hope. Cities fared little better. In Warsaw, official rations for Poles fell to a mere 600 calories per day by 1943, forcing residents to scavenge through garbage or risk dangerous smuggling missions. Black market prices skyrocketed. A kilogram of bread could cost the equivalent of a month's wages. Yet the underground economy remained a lifeline, demonstrating the ingenuity and solidarity of a people determined to endure. Seeds of organized resistance. Amid these brutal conditions, the Polish spirit of resistance only hardened. Forced labor and starvation intended to break morale instead convinced many that survival required collective action. Networks of clandestine aid grew stronger, linking rural farmers with urban resistance cells to distribute food and intelligence. The Polish underground state, already expanding, began to coordinate sabotage missions targeting German supply lines and railroads. Former officers who had escaped capture trained young recruits in guerrilla tactics. Women served as couriers, carrying messages and medical supplies under the guise of ordinary errands. Even within the labor camps and factories of the Reich, Polish workers found ways to resist. They passed coded letters to the outside world, documented atrocities, and in some cases organized slowdowns or strikes, despite the mortal danger. Children of the occupation. Children bore a unique burden. Many grew up knowing only hunger, fear, and the constant threat of capture. Some became breadwinners, risking their lives to smuggle food through sewer tunnels or across guarded checkpoints. Others joined the underground as messengers or lookouts, their small size allowing them to slip past patrols unnoticed. The clandestine schools, Tajne Komplety, remained a beacon of hope. Teachers carried lessons from house to house, disguising textbooks as harmless parcels. Parents whispered Polish poems as bedtime stories, ensuring that their children inherited the language and history the occupiers sought to erase. A young student later recalled each secret lesson was a battle. We were soldiers armed with words, and every word was a victory. A people unbroken. By 1943, the German plan to reduce Poles to a nation of obedient laborers had failed. Hunger was rampant and suffering immense, but the human spirit proved irrepressible. Underground presses printed newspapers recounting Allied victories and exposing Nazi atrocities. Hymns once banned were sung quietly in candlelit rooms. Families continued to celebrate weddings and baptisms, small ceremonies of defiance that reaffirmed life itself. One underground teacher summed up the mood. They can starve us, enslave us, and burn our homes, but they cannot make us forget who we are. The occupiers' attempt to control Poland through hunger and forced labor had backfired. Instead of breaking the nation, it forged a people whose resilience would soon fuel even greater acts of resistance, acts that would echo far beyond the fields and factories of a terrorized land. By 1943, after more than 3 years of brutal occupation, the Polish people had transformed quiet defiance into an extraordinary clandestine government of their own. Out of basements, forests, and secret attics arose the Polish underground state, a unique nationwide resistance network that combined civilian administration, education, and armed struggle. It became, in effect, a second Poland hidden in plain sight beneath the boots of the occupiers. The origins of this underground nation traced back to the first days after the September 1939 defeat, when scattered military units and civilian leaders refused to accept that their country no longer existed. Early resistance groups merged in late 1939 into the Service for Poland's Victory Służba, Zwycięstwo Polski, and a few months later, the Union of Armed Struggle, Związek Walki Zbrojnej, or ZWZ. These groups eventually unified under the authority of the London-based government in exile, ensuring that every clandestine act claimed the legitimacy of a sovereign state. The underground state soon expanded beyond armed resistance. It recreated almost every function of a normal government, a civilian administration, a justice system, and even an education ministry. Schools shuttered by the occupiers reopened in cellars and back rooms, where volunteer teachers held tajne komplety secret classes, where Polish history, literature, and science were taught at great risk. Students memorized lessons hiding books behind false walls. Graduation ceremonies were whispered affairs. A child receiving a clandestine diploma carried proof that Poland's intellectual lifeblood still flowed. A government in the shadows. The underground state operated a parliament in miniature known as the Council of National Unity, which included representatives from across the political spectrum: socialists, conservatives, peasant parties, and nationalists. Decisions were debated and voted on in secret meetings lit by kerosene lamps. Couriers ferried decrees through sewers and forest trails, delivering orders to distant villages. The Home Army, Armia Krajowa, AK, served as the military arm, ultimately swelling to an estimated 300,000 members, making it the largest resistance force in occupied Europe. The AK carried out sabotage operations, derailed trains, cut telegraph lines, and assassinated high-ranking Nazi officials. Their fighters were teachers, farmers, doctors, and teenagers, all united by the belief that Poland must never die. Despite the constant danger of infiltration and brutal reprisals, the underground maintained remarkable discipline and organization. Codes, ciphers, and elaborate communication networks allowed information to flow from Warsaw cellars to the London government in exile. Radio operators tapped out reports on homemade transmitters broadcasting intelligence about German troop movements to the Allies. Justice from the shadows. Perhaps the most audacious aspect of the underground state was its secret court system. These clandestine tribunals sought to maintain a moral and legal order amidst chaos. Judges tried collaborators, traitors, and common criminals. Witnesses testified in candlelit basements. Sentences were carried out swiftly, often by AK fighters. Those convicted of collaboration, informing on neighbors, aiding German police, or profiting from persecution might face exile from their community or, in severe cases, death. These courts were not mere instruments of vengeance. They aimed to preserve a sense of law when the occupiers offered only arbitrary terror. As one underground jurist put it, we sought to prove that Poland still possessed a conscience even in darkness. However, these trials carried unintended consequences. When Polish collaborators were executed or forced out, the occupiers often replaced them with even harsher German officials. Food rations sometimes dwindled further, and reprisals were swift. Yet for many Poles, the moral imperative of justice outweighed the risk. Education and culture as resistance. The underground state recognized that survival depended not only on military action but on safeguarding culture. Teachers and students became soldiers of the intellect. Hidden classrooms taught forbidden subjects from Polish literature to advanced mathematics, ensuring that a generation would emerge educated and prepared to rebuild a free nation. Writers and artists contributed as well. Underground newspapers flourished with titles such as Buletin Informacyjny, circulating weekly in tens of thousands of copies. These publications carried war news, Allied victories, and poems of resistance. Printing presses were hidden behind false walls. Distribution networks spanned cities and villages. To read an underground newspaper was to declare allegiance to Poland. Even music persisted. Secret concerts featured works of Chopin and Moniuszko, their melodies weaving defiance into the night. Attendees risked imprisonment or death, yet they gathered anyway, whispering the national anthem under their breath as German patrols passed outside. Women and youth on the front lines. Women played indispensable roles in the underground state. They served as couriers, nurses, and intelligence agents. Many carried concealed weapons or smuggled documents beneath baskets of bread or inside double-lined coats. A courier might travel hundreds of kilometers by bicycle ferrying messages between resistance cells and the government in exile. Capture meant torture or execution, yet thousands volunteered. Young people were equally vital. Scouts formed special units like the Grey Rank Sare Zaregi, conducting sabotage missions, distributing leaflets, and gathering intelligence. Children as young as 12 acted as lookouts or messengers, slipping through checkpoints unnoticed. Their courage became legendary. Many paid with their lives. German reprisals, and the cost of defiance. The occupiers responded to each act of resistance with savage reprisals. After a successful sabotage mission or assassination, German forces often executed dozens, sometimes hundreds of civilians in collective punishment. Posters appeared on street corners listing the names of those shot in reprisal. In Warsaw, it was not uncommon to see bodies of hostages hanging from lampposts as a warning. These atrocities aimed to terrorize the populace into submission, but they often had the opposite effect. Each act of brutality deepened the resolve of the underground. Families of the executed joined the resistance. Neighbors sheltered fugitives with greater determination. The occupiers discovered that fear could not extinguish a nation's will when that nation had already decided it would rather die than surrender its soul. Everyday courage. Beyond organized operations, countless small acts of bravery sustained the underground state. A farmer hiding a radio beneath a false floor. A librarian secretly preserving banned manuscripts. A priest baptizing children in a cellar chapel. These quiet gestures were as crucial as any armed attack, for they kept alive the everyday rhythms of a country the occupiers insisted no longer existed. An underground teacher captured the sentiment. Each lesson was a battle. Each child who learned our history was another spark in the dark. A nation within a nation. By the middle of 1943, the Polish underground state had become a functioning country beneath the shadow of the Reich. It collected taxes, ran schools, adjudicated crimes, and commanded a formidable army, all while remaining invisible to German eyes. Allied governments recognized its legitimacy, and its intelligence reports proved invaluable to the broader war effort. In a Europe dominated by occupation and collaboration, Poland stood apart, a nation that, though conquered, refused to cease existing. Its people built a hidden republic sustained by courage, intellect, and a belief as old as their anthem, Jeszcze Polska nie zginęła, Poland is not yet lost. The occupiers could torch cities, starve villages, and execute civilians, but they could not kill an idea carried in the hearts of millions. The underground state was living proof that even in the darkest times, a nation's soul can survive quiet, steadfast, and waiting for the moment to rise. As the Polish underground state expanded through 1943, it faced a profound question. How could a nation that officially no longer existed preserve law and order? The occupiers ruled with arbitrary violence, yet the resistance knew that vengeance alone would corrode the moral core of their clandestine republic. Their answer was astonishingly bold, a secret system of underground courts operating entirely in the shadows to uphold a Polish code of justice even under Nazi occupation. These covert tribunals were organized with meticulous care. Civilian branches of the underground state worked alongside the home army to identify collaborators and traitors. Judges, many of them pre-war legal scholars or magistrates, presided over trials held in candlelit cellars or hidden apartments. Proceedings were carefully documented and sworn to follow the principles of pre-war Polish law. Witnesses arrived in disguise, sometimes after long journeys through sewers or forests, to avoid German patrols. Defendants accused of informing on their neighbors, writing propaganda for German-run newspapers, or serving in the occupation administration were summoned by secret message. When they failed to appear, and most knew better than to show up, trials proceeded in absentia. Evidence was presented, witnesses cross-examined, and verdicts rendered with surprising deliberation, considering the peril outside every door. Punishments ranged from warnings and social ostracism to death sentences for those whose actions had caused the arrest or death of fellow Poles. When capital punishment was ordered, the Home Army's special execution squads carried it out swiftly, often in the open streets. These operations were not the chaotic vendettas of a mob, but carefully planned missions intended to demonstrate that even in darkness, a lawful Poland endured. Difficult choices and moral weight. Yet the underground courts carried heavy moral burdens. Each verdict risked brutal German reprisals, collective executions, neighborhood burnings, or mass deportations. A single assassination of a collaborator could lead to the slaughter of dozens of innocent civilians. Some Poles questioned whether these clandestine trials protected or endangered their communities. Parents begged resistance fighters to spare suspected informers for fear that German soldiers would retaliate. Underground leaders debated for hours before authorizing death sentences, weighing the need for justice against the likelihood of innocent blood. One Warsaw jurist later reflected, "We tried not only criminals, but our own conscience. Every decision cost sleep, for we knew the price might be our neighbor's life." Despite these agonizing dilemmas, the courts persisted. They symbolized a nation's refusal to descend into lawlessness and insistence that morality and legality could survive even in the heart of occupation. Underground education and daily defiance. Parallel to the courts, the underground state maintained a vast network of secret schools, ensuring that Poland's intellectual life did not wither. Teachers risked arrest or execution to hold clandestine classes in basements and attics. Students memorized lessons in Polish history, literature, mathematics, and science, often by candlelight, while a lookout watched for German patrols. Graduation ceremonies were whispered affairs, but they carried immense significance. A clandestine diploma was not just a certificate of learning. It was a declaration that the Polish mind would not be conquered. Parents and teachers alike viewed these classes as vital acts of resistance. Cultural life also persisted underground. Poets recited verses in secret gatherings, playwrights staged quiet performances in private apartments, and musicians risked their lives to play forbidden works by Chopin and Moniuszko. Each recital, each poem was an act of defiance against the occupiers' attempt to erase Polish identity. Sabotage and intelligence. While the courts and schools preserved the moral and intellectual fabric of the nation, the Home Army sharpened its military edge. By 1943, its ranks had swelled to hundreds of thousands, making it Europe's largest underground army. Fighters sabotaged railway lines, derailed German supply trains, and cut telegraph wires to disrupt communications. Munitions factories mysteriously caught fire. Bridges collapsed under the weight of German convoys. The Home Army also became a critical intelligence network for the Allies. Using hidden radios and a complex web of couriers, operatives relayed detailed reports on German troop movements, V-1 and V-2 rocket testing, and the atrocities unfolding in extermination camps. Many of these reports reached London and Washington months before Allied intelligence could confirm them, shaping strategic decisions on the wider European front. Women played essential roles as codebreakers, radio operators, and couriers. Disguised as market vendors or nurses, they carried microfilm maps and encrypted messages across heavily guarded checkpoints. Children acted as lookouts, their small size allowing them to slip unnoticed through crowds and alleyways. German reprisals. The Nazis responded to underground activity with savage reprisals. In Warsaw, after a successful assassination of a high-ranking SS officer, German forces rounded up 100 random civilians and executed them publicly as a warning. Posters listing the names of the dead appeared on walls the next morning, stark reminders of the occupiers' collective punishment policy. Entire villages suffered similar fates. If a train was derailed or a bridge destroyed, soldiers would torch nearby settlements and kill their inhabitants. In some regions, the smell of smoke became synonymous with resistance, each charred ruin a testament to both courage and tragedy. These brutal retaliations forced the underground to adopt ever greater secrecy. Cells operated independently so that captured fighters could reveal little under torture. Yet even under such relentless pressure, the network held. The will to resist proved stronger than the fear of death. The Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. The most dramatic symbol of this indomitable spirit erupted in the spring of 1943 when the Jewish resistance inside the Warsaw Ghetto rose against the Germans. After years of starvation and mass deportations, a few hundred fighters armed with smuggled pistols, homemade grenades, and an unyielding will launched a desperate rebellion. For nearly a month, they held off well-armed German forces, inflicting significant casualties and forcing temporary retreats. The Polish Home Army provided limited arms and tactical support, but the ghetto fighters knew their chances of survival were slim. Their objective was not victory, but dignity, to die on their own terms and inspire future resistance. When the Germans finally crushed the uprising, they razed the ghetto block by block, killing about 13,000 people and sending the survivors to extermination camps. Yet the courage of those fighters reverberated far beyond Warsaw's ruined streets, proving that even in the face of certain death, the human spirit could defy annihilation. The cost and the resolve. By late 1943, Poland's underground nation stood bloodied but unbowed. Its courts continued to dispense justice. Its teachers still met in hidden classrooms. Its fighters struck German supply lines and gathered intelligence for the Allies. The occupiers had thrown every weapon, terror, starvation, mass murder against a people they sought to break. Instead, they had forged a society that lived entirely beneath the surface, invisible yet vibrant, united by the unshakable conviction expressed in the national refrain, Jeszcze Polska nie zginęła. Poland is not yet lost. The stage was set for an even greater gamble, a nationwide uprising to reclaim the capital itself. As the Red Army advanced from the east and the German front lines weakened, the Home Army began to plan an audacious strike to liberate Warsaw and announce to the world that Poland, though scarred, still lived. By the winter of 1943, the clandestine networks of the Polish underground state and its military, armed the Home Army, Armia Krajowa, had matured into one of the most formidable resistance forces in occupied Europe. What began as scattered sabotage and intelligence gathering was now an organized campaign aimed at striking the occupiers wherever they were vulnerable. Across Poland, railways became targets of relentless attacks. Saboteurs loosened bolts on critical bridges, planted explosives under rail lines, and derailed supply trains bound for the Eastern Front. Each derailment delayed German reinforcements fighting the Soviet advance and sent a jolt of hope through the countryside. Munitions factories were infiltrated by workers who quietly disabled machines or mixed sand into lubricants, ensuring that weapons failed at the front. These operations required a delicate balance of precision and secrecy. Fighters traveled at night through forests guided by moonlight and coded signals. Villagers provided food and shelter, knowing discovery meant execution. When operations succeeded, news spread quickly by underground press and word of mouth, proving that the occupiers' grip was not unbreakable. The Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. The most striking act of defiance came from within the walls of the Warsaw Ghetto. After years of starvation, disease, and the deportation of hundreds of thousands to extermination camps, a coalition of Jewish fighters resolved to meet death on their own terms. In April 1943, as German forces prepared another mass deportation, resistance fighters, armed with a handful of pistols, stolen rifles, and homemade Molotov cocktails, ambushed Nazi patrols. They struck from rooftops and hidden bunkers, forcing the heavily armed Germans into retreat during the first assaults. The Home Army supplied limited weapons and intelligence, but the Jewish fighters knew they could not win a conventional battle. Their goal was to inspire the world and to choose dignity over passive extermination. For nearly a month, smoke and gunfire filled the ghetto as the fighters defied overwhelming odds. German commander Jürgen Stroop responded with ruthless efficiency. Block by block, his forces set buildings ablaze using flamethrowers and explosives to flush out the rebels. By May, the uprising was crushed. About 13,000 Jews were killed, and the ghetto lay in smoldering ruins. Yet the courage of these fighters echoed far beyond Warsaw. Their defiance became a symbol of resistance for oppressed peoples everywhere, and a rallying cry for the broader Polish underground. Operation Tempest. In the aftermath of the Ghetto Uprising, the Home Army prepared for a new and even more ambitious campaign, Operation Tempest, Akcja Burza. Launched in early 1944 as the Soviet Red Army pushed westward and the German front faltered, Operation Tempest aimed to liberate Polish cities before Soviet troops arrived, demonstrating that the Polish government in exile, not Moscow, was the legitimate authority in a free Poland. The plan called for local uprisings across the country as the Red Army advanced. Home Army units would strike German garrisons, seize key infrastructure, and welcome Soviet troops as allies, at least temporarily, in the hope that Poland's sovereignty would be recognized after the war. In January 1944, the first major Tempest actions erupted in the eastern borderlands. Thousands of Home Army soldiers emerged from hiding to attack German positions in Volhynia and the Vilnius region. They disrupted supply lines, captured weapons, and cooperated tactically with Soviet forces to expel German occupiers. For a moment, it seemed possible that a grand alliance might save Poland's independence. A bitter Soviet betrayal. But as the Red Army advanced, grim reality set in. Soviet commanders viewed the Home Army not as allies, but as potential rivals to communist control. After joint operations, Soviet troops often disarmed Polish fighters, arrested their officers, and deported them to gulags. Some were executed outright. Reports of these betrayals filtered back to the underground leadership in Warsaw. The dream of a free, independent Poland secured through cooperation with the Soviets began to fade. Still, the Home Army pressed forward, believing that only dramatic action could keep the hope of sovereignty alive, preparing for the Warsaw Uprising. By the summer of 1944, all eyes turned to Warsaw. The capital, long a center of underground activity, was a potent symbol of national pride. Intelligence suggested that the Red Army was approaching the eastern bank of the Vistula River. If the Home Army could seize control of the city before the Soviets arrived, the government in exile might re-establish authority on Polish soil, forcing international recognition of Polish independence. Underground cells stockpiled weapons, rifles, smuggled from Allied airdrops, grenades, fashioned from plumbing pipes, Molotov cocktails mixed in kitchen basements. Fighters drilled in secret, while couriers raced through sewers with messages from the government in exile in London. Ordinary citizens prepared as well. Women trained as medics gathered medical supplies and sewed armbands bearing the red and white Polish colors. Children were enlisted as messengers and scouts. In every neighborhood, whispered rumors carried the same electric charge: the uprising is coming. The Home Army's rising strength. By July 1944, the Home Army had grown to an estimated 350,000 members, though weapons remained scarce. Many fighters would carry only a single firearm or grenade, yet morale was high. Years of underground organization had created a disciplined force with strong community support. Meanwhile, the German occupiers, though stretched thin by the advancing Soviets, fortified key positions and prepared for street-to-street combat. SS troops and police units experienced in brutal suppression waited for any sign of rebellion. The stage was set for one of the most dramatic and tragic chapters of the war, the Warsaw Uprising. Sparks beyond Warsaw. Even before the capital exploded, resistance flared across the countryside. Partisan units ambushed German convoys, dynamited rail bridges, and harassed retreating Wehrmacht columns. In the Lublin region, fighters liberated towns for brief, heady days before Soviet forces moved in and claimed control. Women played indispensable roles, carrying weapons hidden in breadbaskets, nursing wounded partisans, and relaying intelligence from village to village. Their courage under fire became legendary, inspiring more to join the cause. These actions inflicted real damage on German logistics and signaled to the world that Poland was not a passive victim, but an active participant in the fight against tyranny, a nation waiting to erupt. As August approached, Warsaw seethed with tension. Red Army artillery rumbled faintly from the east. German patrols tightened security, aware that the city was a tinderbox. In cramped apartments and candlelit basements, Home Army officers studied maps and final orders. On August 1st, 1944, the signal would come. Thousands of men and women, shopkeepers, students, teachers, laborers would rise with rifles, pistols, and homemade explosives to seize their city and proclaim to the world Poland lives. The cost would be unimaginable, but the spirit that had survived invasion, occupation, starvation, and betrayal was ready to face it. The sparks of armed resistance, fanned for years in secrecy, were about to ignite into a conflagration that would burn in history forever. At dawn, on August 1st, 1944, the long-anticipated signal flashed across Warsaw W Hour. Church bells rang, underground radios crackled to life, and couriers sped through alleys with whispered orders. After 5 years of occupation, the Home Army Armia Krajowa rose to reclaim the capital. Men and women who had spent years in shadow stepped into the streets armed with pistols, rifles, scavenged from fallen soldiers, and improvised Molotov cocktails. For a few electrifying hours, Warsaw belonged to its people. The initial success, yes, was stunning. Resistance fighters seized police stations, captured German weapons depots, and took control of major intersections. Red and white flags blossomed from rooftops. Civilians cheered as barricades of overturned trams and cobblestones sprouted across boulevards. In cafes, once dark with fear, neighbors embraced, daring to believe that liberation had arrived. The uprising was the centerpiece of Operation Tempest, a nationwide plan to liberate Polish territory as the Soviet Red Army advanced from the east. Underground leaders hoped to present the Allies and Moscow with a fait accompli, a free capital governed by the Polish government in exile, proving that Poland was no Soviet satellite, but an independent nation. A calculated Soviet pause. At first, the gamble seemed to pay off. Soviet forces stood just across the Vistula River, their artillery audible from Warsaw's eastern suburbs. Fighters in the city expected the Red Army to cross quickly and join the battle against the Germans. But days passed, and the Soviets did not move. Stalin, viewing the non-communist Home Army as a rival, chose to wait while the Germans and Poles exhausted each other. Despite repeated appeals from the government in exile and desperate radio messages from within Warsaw, Soviet commanders offered only token support, halting their offensive while German reinforcements poured in. The Home Army, which had launched its rebellion in the belief that Allied aid was imminent, suddenly faced the brutal reality of fighting alone. Street-to-street warfare, German forces struck back with savage precision. SS units under the command of Erich von dem Bach-Zelewski moved methodically through Warsaw, wielding artillery, tanks, and flamethrowers. Entire districts became battlefields. Fighters defended barricades with homemade grenades and captured weapons, retreating only when buildings collapsed around them. Civilians were caught in the crossfire or targeted outright. In the Wola district, SS troops massacred between 30,000 and 40,000 civilians in a single week, executing men, women, and children and setting their homes ablaze. Elsewhere, hospitals were shelled and medical staff shot as they tried to care for the wounded. The smell of smoke and the thunder of artillery became the city's constant soundtrack. Yet the insurgents fought with extraordinary tenacity. Sewer tunnels became lifelines for moving troops and supplies. Couriers darted through rubble-strewn streets to deliver messages. Improvised workshops turned plumbing pipes into mortars and children's toys into explosives. Entire families labored side by side, fathers on the barricades, mothers as medics, children as messengers, bound by the conviction that Warsaw must remain Polish, if only for a single triumphant moment. Desperate appeals and Allied airdrops. The government in exile pleaded with Western allies for assistance. British and American aircraft attempted perilous supply drops, parachuting crates of weapons, food, and medical supplies over the city. Many missed their targets or fell into German hands, but some reached the fighters, sustaining the struggle week after week. Still, the odds were overwhelming. German artillery reduced entire neighborhoods to rubble. Water and electricity failed. Food dwindled to scraps of bread and thin soups cooked over makeshift stoves. Hospitals overflowed and surgeons worked by candlelight without anesthetics, using rainwater collected in barrels to clean wounds. Heroism amid the rubble. Despite the horror, stories of courage abounded. Nurses risked sniper fire to retrieve wounded fighters from no man's land. Priests administered last rites amid collapsing buildings. Women carried ammunition through sewers, waist-deep in foul water, guided only by faint lantern light. Children continued to serve as lookouts and couriers, slipping past German patrols with astonishing calm. One young messenger, barely 13 later, recalled, "I thought of fear as a luxury. We had only duty to our families, to Poland. There was no room for anything else." For 2 months, the insurgents held large portions of the city, an extraordinary feat against a vastly superior enemy. They fought not merely for territory, but for the principle that Poland still lived. The brutal end. By September, the uprising was collapsing under relentless bombardment. German forces systematically destroyed Warsaw block by block, using artillery and dynamite to level entire districts. Civilians sheltered in basements as buildings above them vanished in roaring clouds of dust. Starvation set in. Clean water became almost impossible to find. On October 2, 1944, After 63 days of ferocious combat, the exhausted home army surrendered. The Germans promised to treat fighters as prisoners of war and to spare the remaining civilians, but their subsequent actions belied these assurances. Nearly 700,000 residents were expelled from the city, marched to transit camps in freezing weather. Many were sent on to labor camps in Germany. Others were left homeless in the countryside. German engineers then carried out Hitler's order to annihilate the capital. Street by street, they planted explosives and reduced Warsaw to rubble. By the war's end, over 85% of the city lay in ruins, a deliberate act of cultural eradication. A Pyrrhic but powerful legacy. The Warsaw Uprising cost the lives of more than 100,000 Polish civilians and around 16,000 resistance fighters. To many contemporaries, it seemed a catastrophic failure, yet its symbolic power could not be erased. For 63 days, the people of Warsaw, outgunned, undersupplied, and abandoned by supposed allies, proved that the Polish nation could rise and fight for its freedom. The uprising inspired resistance movements across Europe and left an indelible mark on post-war Polish identity. Survivors carried their stories into exile or into the dark years of Soviet domination that followed, ensuring that the memory of their sacrifice would not fade. Across occupied Poland, while Warsaw burned, resistance continued elsewhere. Partisan units in forests and mountains harassed German garrisons, ambushed convoys, and destroyed bridges. In regions like the Kielce countryside and the Białowieża forest, fighters maintained pressure on retreating German forces, keeping alive the belief that liberation, though delayed, was inevitable. But as the Red Army advanced westward after the uprising's suppression, the harsh truth emerged. Soviet troops who finally entered the ruins of Warsaw in January 1945 found a city of ghosts. They offered little acknowledgement of the Home Army's heroism and swiftly moved to dismantle any remnants of non-communist resistance. The human cost, the combined toll of the uprising and the preceding occupation, was staggering. Entire families vanished. Streets once filled with markets and music became fields of ash. Survivors carried scars, physical and emotional, that would endure for generations. Yet amidst the rubble lay a defiant truth. The Germans had destroyed a city, but not a nation. The courage displayed during the Warsaw Uprising became a cornerstone of Polish national memory, a testament to the resilience that had sustained the country through partitions, invasions, and decades of foreign rule. Toward the war's end, by late 1944, the Nazi grip on Europe was weakening, but for Poland, the future remained uncertain. The Western Allies celebrated impending victory, while Stalin prepared to impose a new domination. As 1945 approached, Poles who had fought for freedom faced the bitter reality that liberation from one tyrant might mean subjugation by another. Still, the cry that had echoed since 1939 persisted. Jeszcze Polska nie zginęła. Poland is not yet lost. Through the smoke and ruins of Warsaw, through the forests, where partisans still roamed, the idea of a free Poland endured, waiting for the moment when the world would again recognize the nation that had never truly died. When the smoke of war finally cleared in 1945, Poland emerged from 6 years of occupation as a nation physically devastated and profoundly scarred. The human toll alone defies comprehension. More than 5.6 million Polish citizens, over 20% of the pre-war population, were dead. Roughly 3 million of them were Jews, victims of the Holocaust. Entire towns had vanished. Families were scattered across continents or buried in mass graves. Survivors returned to cities reduced to rubble and countryside pocked with the ruins of villages burned in reprisals. Warsaw, once the cultural and political heart of the nation, lay in almost complete ruin. German demolition squads, following Hitler's order to obliterate the city after the failed uprising, had leveled more than 85% of its buildings. Photographs taken in early 1945 show little more than a moonscape of shattered bricks and skeletal church towers. Streets that had once echoed with music and cafe chatter were silent, carpeted in ash. The capital was less a city than a vast graveyard. Other urban centers fared little better. Industrial hubs like Łódź and Krakow bore deep scars of bombing and looting. Rail networks lay twisted and useless. Farmlands had been stripped of livestock and equipment. Harvests were meager after years of forced requisitioning and scorched earth retreats. Hunger lingered as a shadow long after the guns fell silent. A nation betrayed. For many Poles, liberation brought no sense of triumph. The Red Army's arrival, delayed during the 1944 Warsaw Uprising, now revealed the geopolitical reality that had haunted the Home Army's leaders. Poland's fate would not be decided in Warsaw or even Berlin, but in the conferences of Yalta and Potsdam. Despite fighting from the war's first day and supplying some of the Allies' most valuable intelligence, Poland was handed to the Soviet sphere of influence. Stalin installed a communist-controlled government, sidelining the London-based government in exile that had directed the underground state. Home Army veterans who had survived years of clandestine struggle were suddenly branded as enemies of the new regime. Many were arrested by the NKVD, imprisoned or sent to labor camps. Some were executed after show trials. For those who had endured Nazi terror while dreaming of a free democratic Poland, this second subjugation was a bitter blow. One resistance fighter recalled, "We fought the Germans for independence, and when they were gone, we found ourselves prisoners of another empire, rebuilding from ashes." Yet even in this bleak political landscape, the Polish spirit of renewal stirred. Refugees returned to skeletal homes and began to clear debris by hand. Brick by brick, Warsaw slowly rose again. Survivors salvaged fragments of churches and palaces to reconstruct the old town, guided by pre-war paintings and photographs. This painstaking work became an act of collective therapy. To rebuild was to reclaim identity. Cultural life flickered back to existence almost immediately. Secretly preserved manuscripts and artworks resurfaced. Musicians performed Chopin once more in public halls. Teachers reopened schools, many still operating in temporary shelters determined to educate children who had learned their first lessons in basements and forests. The reemergence of religious life was equally powerful. Churches long suppressed or destroyed welcomed worshippers who had kept their faith alive in whispered prayers. Each Mass was both spiritual renewal and a quiet affirmation of national continuity. Memory and mourning. The memory of occupation became a central thread in Poland's post-war identity. Families searched for the missing sons, taken as forced laborers, daughters, deported to camps, parents who vanished in midnight arrests. Some waited years for answers that never came. Memorials and cemeteries dotted the land, from the mass graves of Palmyra to the ruins of Treblinka and Auschwitz. Survivors recorded their experiences in diaries and testimonies, determined that the world should not forget. Underground newspapers, once instruments of resistance, now published memoirs and eyewitness accounts. Artists captured both the horrors and the heroism of the era. Poets wrote of the Warsaw Uprising, painters depicted the ghetto fighters' last stand, composers wove lamentations into symphonies. These stories served not only as remembrance, but as quiet defiance of Soviet attempts to control historical narrative. While official propaganda often minimized the role of the Home Army or recast the Red Army as sole liberators, families passed down the truth in kitchens and parish halls. Grandparents told children of secret classrooms, smuggled bread, and the anthem whispered in the dark, "Jeszcze Polska nie zginęła." Poland is not yet lost. The cost of resistance. The sacrifices of those years defy easy reckoning. The Home Army lost tens of thousands of fighters in combat and executions. Entire Jewish communities, centuries old, were extinguished. Intellectuals, artists, and clergy were murdered in numbers that left lasting gaps in Poland's cultural fabric. And yet, the resistance had achieved something profound. It preserved a sense of nationhood when every external symbol of the nation had been torn away. Through clandestine education, underground courts, and the audacity of the Warsaw Uprising, Poles kept alive the idea of a free Poland, an idea that would inspire later generations to challenge Soviet control and decades later to help bring down the Iron Curtain. Echoes. Through the Cold War. During the long years of communist rule, memories of Nazi occupation mingled with fresh struggles against censorship and political repression. Former Home Army fighters were often persecuted, their heroism acknowledged only in private. But the spirit of defiance that had sustained the underground state resurfaced in new movement student protests in 1968 workers' strikes in the 1970s, and ultimately the solidarity movement of the 1980s that helped dismantle communist power. In each uprising, Poles invoked the same lineage of courage. Banners bore the red and white flag once flown from Warsaw's barricades. Protesters sang songs first whispered in secret classrooms. The legacy of 1939 to 1945 lived on a reminder that freedom might be delayed, but never extinguished. Enduring lessons. The story of Poland under German occupation is one of staggering loss, but also of remarkable resilience. The occupiers sought to annihilate a nation, its leaders, its culture, its very memory. Instead, they revealed the extraordinary capacity of ordinary people to resist. Teachers who held clandestine lessons, mothers who hid neighbors in basements, teenagers who smuggled weapons or messages, all became guardians of a nation's soul. Their courage offers enduring lessons. It shows that identity is not confined to borders or governments. It lives in shared language, in music, in quiet acts of solidarity. It demonstrates that even in an age of mechanized terror, humanity can refuse to surrender its dignity. A nation unbroken. When the war ended, Poland stood amid ruins, but it stood. The Germans had destroyed its cities and murdered millions, yet they had not destroyed its essence. The anthem that had echoed through whispered prayers proved prophetic. Jeszcze Polska nie zginęła póki my żyjemy. Poland is not yet lost as long as we live. From the ashes of Warsaw to the exiles scattered across Europe and beyond, that spirit endured. It inspired those who rebuilt the old town brick by brick, those who resisted Soviet domination, and those who ultimately reclaimed full independence decades later. Today, memorials across Poland honor both the fallen and the fighters, the nameless villagers who sheltered refugees, the soldiers of the Home Army, the Jewish heroes of the Warsaw Ghetto. Their stories remind the world that freedom is never granted. It is earned and defended, often at unimaginable cost. The German occupation sought to erase a nation from history. Instead, it forged a people whose will to live and to remember could not be extinguished. Poland emerged not merely as a survivor, but as a testament to the power of human endurance and the unbreakable bond between memory and identity.